what happened to Air India, it's a puzzle right now. And there's a couple of things we could talk about. What are some of the most likely possibilities? It failed to generate enough thrust to climb, or maybe it got behind what's called getting behind the power curve, where it was in a configuration that was causing too much drag for the power available. It was very hot, it was heavily loaded, etc. All of these things no doubt contributed. Rupert Murdoch has a huge effect on how things get discussed, because he wants to say, did aliens cause the Air India crash? As insane as it is, that will become a major discussion. People will be talking about it and taking it seriously.
So they do say that flying is statistically still the safest mode of travel, and it might be true, but it feels somehow increasingly irrelevant to the passenger. Maybe because the margin for error is razor thin, and when things fail, they fail dramatically.
People tend to think of MH370 as the plane that disappeared, as the Netflix documentary titled it. The plane didn't just disappear. What happened to MH370 is much more complicated and profoundly weird.
So you've long argued that MH370 may not have gone south at all, right? That someone manipulated the Inmarsat satellite data and spoofed the handshake signals and flew the plane towards Kazakhstan, right?
How do we prevent getting hacked? It's a major thing. It's a real thing. We're seeing an increase in proportion of those accidents that somehow involve the interaction between humans and automated systems, where the humans might not understand what the automated system is trying to do, and the automated system might not be able to handle.
As we await the official report, another question hovers. When the answers come, will we believe them? Good evening. What if air travel is no longer a marvel, but a risk we've normalized? We board, we buckle in, we surrender to code and combustion, and trust the system will hold. But when a Dreamliner crashes 2 minutes after takeoff in Ahmedabad, no weather, no warning, just a sudden and terminal failure, or when a helicopter and a commercial plane collide in the most monitored airspace in the world, amongst many other incidents still fresh in our memory, the system seems to be collapsing around us. The machines haven't just malfunctioned, the stories around them have too. And perhaps that is the deeper turbulence, the way information breaks down in the age of real-time catastrophe. We are surrounded by data, and yet clarity feels more distant than ever. Today, we speak with aviation journalist Jeff Wise, one of the most dogged investigators into the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines MH370. But this is no longer a cold case interview. It is about the voids disasters create and who gets to fill them. This is Dark Matter, Bright Minds. I'm Pratha Kejriwal. Let's begin. Welcome, Jeff. How have you been today?
Well, that was a great introduction. Thank you so much. It sounds like you've really got an interesting perspective on this, which I think is badly needed, actually. I think that kind of level of analysis has largely been missing. So it's great to hear you say that. I'm well. We had a terrible heat wave here, which would probably be no big deal at all in parts of India. But, you know, we were struggling here, but we're okay now.
Okay. All right, Jeff. So, I'd originally imagined this conversation unfolding slightly differently. But when the Air India crash happened, it kind of shifted everything. When something like that unfolds in your own airspace, it's no longer just about mystery. It is about urgency and proximity. So let me begin there. And I want to risk asking the question, which perhaps I'm not supposed to ask, at least not this early. But the crash of Air India Flight AI171 happened in seconds. And in that compressed frame of time and condition, the absurdity of the situation falls a bit too heavy on our general psyche to process for too long without at least some answers. So let me ask you cautiously but directly, what is your theory?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think the important thing to understand about Air India is that it's like MH370 at this point in that we don't know.
Yeah.
That's the important thing to understand. We don't know. And so what do you do when you don't know? Now, of course, we want answers. We want to hear theories. There's a natural human instinct to try to explain and understand. And coming up with theories is an important part of that process. But I think what happens too often is that there's a natural human tendency to hear a theory, to hear an explanation, and just accept it. I mean, it's really in my line of work where I sort of I'm trying to process this deep mystery. And one of the real dynamics that I struggle with is the extent to which the audience has already made its mind up. I mean, if you look at the comments on my
Mhm.
podcast, Finding MH370, both on the YouTube channel and on the show page at findingmh370.com, you'll see time and time again people coming in and saying, "You're dumb. I already know what happened. It's this, 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 and this." And when you hear a theory, when you latch onto a theory, it kills curiosity. In fact, it's sort of the opposite of curiosity. Is people become like their beliefs become something to defend. And this goes beyond religion. Of course,
Yeah.
Hindus and Muslims killing each other because of their beliefs has been happening for how many centuries. Christians, Muslims, etc. But this happens even on the most kind of trite and mundane thing.
Yes.
In the case of a transportation accident that most people have no direct stake whatsoever in, and
Yeah.
yet people like latch onto an idea and will defend it to the death. It's amazing and rather disheartening. So, which is a very long discursion from your question, what happened to Air India? It's a puzzle right now, and there's a couple of things we could talk about. What are some of the most likely possibilities?
Hmm.
It failed to generate enough thrust to climb, or maybe it got behind what's called getting behind the power curve, where it was in a configuration that was causing too much drag for the
Hmm.
power available. It was very hot, it was heavily loaded, etc. All of these things no doubt contributed. But it's like MH370 in that we don't know. It doesn't seem like the officials have come up with answers yet, which it's too early to complain about that yet because it does take a certain amount of time. But we do have to ask ourselves, how do we venture into the unknown? How do we
Yeah.
take facts, take information, take data, and how do we produce a meaningful and importantly actionable understanding of the universe? What can we do?
Yes.
Because from an air accident investigation, while I think the media and the public tends to focus on the human tragedy aspect of it, from a flight investigator's perspective, it's an opportunity. Every crash is a chance to try to prevent it from happening again.
Absolutely. But, it's been probably 2 weeks. Yes, I think it's just 2 weeks since the crash. And the way information has flown from the authorities here has felt quite thin. There's
Hmm.
been no clear timeline, no provisional analysis, no regular briefings, just a
Yeah.
vague sense that the system is working behind a curtain. And if I were to contrast this with the Potomac collision in January, where within days the NTSB had issued briefings, the FAA had released airspace revisions, and the public at least had a sense of what was being asked and answered. So, my question is, do you see the Indian response as unusually opaque or just operating within a different rhythm of disclosure?
So the the world aviation culture is fragmented into each country, right? Each country has its own regulations, has its own traditions and sort of perspective and leadership. And so you can look at how the United States might do it, how the UK might do it, or how Japan or Indonesia. Every country has its own approach. In China, there's a major crash where a plane just sort of like just descended out of the sky, and this was years ago, and we still don't know. The Chinese just haven't really given any answers.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I feel like many countries in the world just don't have as open and as nimble a response to this kind of tragedy as we would really like. And the most of the growth of aviation around the world is taking place in countries like China, India, Indonesia, the developing world. And so everyone learns as they go. And I hope that the Indian public pressures the government and
Mhm.
complains. I mean, I think you really, if you don't like how things are going, you have to really complain. Um, and so, because ultimately, yeah, you want answers, especially if you're going to get on a plane yourself. How many?
Yeah, I know, but you've worked as an aviation journalist for so long, and in every crash, I'm sure there is a general structure. So, who actually controls the flow of information and who delays it, and who ultimately benefits when meaning is managed and not revealed?
The investigation is generally in the under the purview of the country where the crash occurred.
Hmm.
The country that is the flag carrier is also a major part. So, for instance, when MH317 was shot down, it was a Malaysian flagged plane that had
Hmm.
come from the Netherlands and it occurred in Ukraine. So those are three countries that have like special status. Ukraine was at war at the time, so my understanding is that they mostly handed it over to the Dutch. Um, so it's a little complicated, as international affairs generally are. Boeing and Airbus being the only two real significant manufacturers of airliners tend to get
Yeah.
heavily involved. I think I've gotten off the track of what your question was, though.
Yeah, I was just asking that, who controls the narrative and at what levels? Like, I'm sure there is the government which is controlling the narrative. Of course, the manufacturers, there is a certain sort of a manufacturer protectionism that might also be at play. And then, of course, the geopolitics of it all. So, in general, there is this whole vagueness as far as the general public is concerned when an air crash occurs, and then the investigation keeps going on for a long period of time, and then it kind of fades away from public
Yeah,
memory as well. So,
yeah. I mean, the period of attention is very short.
yes.
Even for really important crashes, I think the Air India crash is a highly significant crash, and for many reasons.
Yeah.
You were mentioning the crash that took place in Washington D.C. in January. That was our first fatal airline crash in the United States in 16 years. So it really was a historical crash.
Mm.
You asked a really, really important and difficult question, which is who controls the narrative? Like
Yeah.
who decides what we talk about when we
Yeah.
talk about a crash? And that is extremely complex. Yes, the flag carrier, the country. It's at one level, the country that controls the crash investigation exerts a lot of influence over how the thing gets discussed. They can control the news cycle. I'm sorry, the word I'm looking for is news cycle. They
Yeah.
control the news cycle, and that they can make an announcement, and that's what people are going to be talking about that day. But then there's also, Murdoch. I mean,
Yeah.
Rupert Murdoch has a huge effect on how things get discussed because if he wants to talk about, if he wants to say, did aliens cause the Air India crash? As insane as it is, that will become a major discussion. People will be talking about it and taking it seriously. But then you also have a kind of organic way that things get discussed, where there are communities that discuss
Yeah.
things and talk about things, and those can kind of take hold at a sort of grassroots level. We've certainly
Mm.
seen that with MH370, which is an unusual case, I think, in the extent that it has sort of persisted beyond the news cycle. It is a long, slow burning interest. It's like a kind of, if you imagine like a brush fire that's kind of smoldering. There's embers here and there, so that when conditions are appropriate, it will roar back into life. And so, in
Mm.
the case of MH370, we recently had an American company volunteer to start searching again, and you saw this sort of rush of oxygen, and all of a sudden, everyone wanted to talk about
Mm.
this case again. Um, so there's a lot of different factors that affect. And then, of course, ultimately, you have I think, a related phenomenon, which is consensus. Like, what do people think happened? There's,
Mm.
based on my experience with people commenting on my podcast, I think there's a really wide range of beliefs. There's a sort of a dominant conventional wisdom,
Mm.
and people get really mad if you question that conventional wisdom. There's a lot of kind of fringe conspiracy theories. I have my view that I've been trying to explicate,
Yeah.
but it feels at this point very much an open mystery. We really don't know what happened to this plane, and there's lots of things to be said. Something like Air India, I have to believe that ultimately the government will not be able to withhold the facts of this case for very long. I mean, it's just an extremely important case. I think there's enormous, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's enormous interest in India to understand what happened.
Absolutely. I will be coming to MH370. in depth. We'll be
Okay.
discussing that. But before that, I just wanted to ask you, just to continue that point, that as an independent journalist, who doesn't have any direct stakes in all of this, how do you navigate this terrain in your search for truth?
I've been kind of learning as I go. I mean,
Mm.
frankly, it's a moving target. The technology that shapes the nature of the discourse is, of course, constantly changing. The
Yes.
platform, maybe when MH370 disappeared, Facebook was a dominant platform.
Mm.
Now it's much less so. You've got other things have risen up in its place. Twitter was very important for a long time. Now
Mm.
it's falling by the wayside. So you're constantly having to kind of hop from, I liken it to the polar bears who are trying to live on these ice floes that are constantly melting under them. They're constantly having to jump from one melting ice floe to another to try to find a place to stand, and it's
Mm.
challenging. I mean, you're trying to deal with a topic, and then you're also trying to deal with the sort of meta topic of like, how do you even discuss things? How do people absorb and process information anymore?
Absolutely. Okay. But after every crash, whenever people talk to experts, and I heard you also say that, I think in one of your Guardian interviews, that ultimately air travel is the safest mode of travel, no matter what you perceive at this moment, or no matter how much anxiety you feel. So they do say that flying is statistically still the safest mode of travel, and it might be true, but it feels somehow increasingly irrelevant to the passenger. Maybe because the margin for error is razor thin, and when things fail, they fail dramatically. And whenever a crash occurs with so many conflicting theories, it feels like a rupture in comprehension. So if flying is so safe, why does it increasingly feel so unstable?
Well, I think we've gotten used to things not happening. We've come to kind of take it for granted. I don't know how much of a sea change it's been. I think it's been more of a kind of gradual shift. This is my perception.
Hmm.
Lots of people have always been anxious about flying.
Yeah,
They
that is
and
true.
yet they overcome that. Most people just overcome it. I want to
Mhm.
go visit my nephew. I want
Yeah.
to go see the big game in another city. I'm going to
Yeah.
get on a plane. I'm going to go there. I'm going to do things that would be impossible any other way.
Mm.
And I will swallow my anxiety. And now, what something like that, you get the Washington crash, you get the Air India crash, and all of a sudden your anxiety level goes up, but you still get on the plane. That's, I think, the important. I don't think air travel numbers have been affected by any of these things. So I think
Mm.
it's a psychological effect, but I don't think you're seeing a behavioral consequence.
Do you think it is so because of the crack between the event and the explanation? That is the real terrain of the crisis? Because, and we've built this whole mythology around the black box, but it kind of, that the idea that it holds the truth and it will be delivered one day, but case after case kind of shows us that the box is found, but still the story is splintered. So do you think this lack of explanation adds to the anxiety, perhaps?
I think it does. I mean, I think it certainly does. What's so important in our modern world is trust, because we live in a system which gives us so much, is capable of delivering so many things. If you're plugged into the world economy, you can get stuff delivered, in a very short time, thanks to this incredibly complex network of ships and planes and trains and automobiles and everything. But it's so complex that the human mind can't really comprehend it. Maybe people whose job it is to manage these systems can understand them, but nobody else really can. And so we have to trust. We have to trust in the authorities. We have to trust in expertise. Unfortunately, we live in a moment in which, um, you know, this advanced capitalistic society is under attack. And I sometimes call it like the liberal democratic West or something like that. And it's not really the West. It's all very global right now. But I think on the one hand, we have tendencies towards openness, science, capitalism, free trade, rule of law, and so on, and hopefully, increasing the betterment of society. And so I see that right now at this historical moment, kind of since the turn of the century, as being badly under attack. by forces of oligarchy, corruption, and you know, almost autocracy, let's say, and that's happening. And I feel that the people who have gotten used to democracy, have gotten used to openness, don't realize it. They're so used to it. And I think this ties into the air crash thing, where we've become kind of used to trusting, and then when our trust is violated, we're sort of shocked and we don't really know what to do. We feel helpless. And so a lot of what I spend my time thinking about is like, how do you grapple with a feeling of helplessness? How do you escape from helplessness? And unfortunately, I think it requires waking up, paying attention, trying to understand the forces that are at work, and it takes a certain amount of effort, I think, which people, one of the problems of kind of capitalism is that it really kind of lures everyone into a state of being a consumer, like feeling like all I have to do is choose whether I want Coke or Pepsi, and that's all I have to do, and my choice is sacred, and like this is how I express myself. It makes us very passive, I think, and that's dangerous.
And in such a situation, when, for example, when somebody like one person sitting on 11A survives the crash, then I think uh, they attach this miraculous quality to the whole thing. Religious people, I mean, I'm sure, at some point this person who survived the crash can make his own cult and with
Yeah,
loads of followers. How do you
right.
explain that? How do we explain that away? And how does one explain the surviving of this one singular passenger in this inferno?
Well, it is amazing, isn't it? And it's actually surprisingly not that rare. I actually was involved in a documentary production that was called Soul Survivor, and it was looking at all these cases where only one person had survived,
Hmm.
and it seems like it happens a fair bit, which is a little bit shocking. Um, how do you interpret luck? I mean, there's so many things there's so much randomness in the world. I mean, if you just think about like why we exist, because of the trillions of sperm, one fertilized the egg, and now here you are. We're all lottery winners, really. And how do
Yeah.
you explain that? God or some? Listen, I mean, there's a lot about the world that's fascinating and unknown, and people have been wrestling with this for thousands of years. I mean, one of the interesting questions that I find myself thinking about lately is, can philosophy improve? Like, is it something that can get better? We know that science can improve.
Yeah.
Can we think of philosophy as a kind of science? I mean, I feel like we've changed a lot, right? I think in Europe, they used to like have wars over whether the communion wafer was an actual piece of Jesus Christ or whether it was a metaphor for a piece of Jesus Christ. And they would, thousands of people would die because they would argue about these points. I think we've moved beyond that in a way that's good. So, um, I've once again gotten away kind of from your question, but I do think that these are sort of imponderables that we can nevertheless sort of try to grapple with and hopefully move forward.
Absolutely. Well, if this crash is so hard to live with, the disappearance of MH370 has been perhaps the hardest. But now, after 11 years, Ocean Infinity has resumed its search. And so, was there any new evidence which sparked these renewed efforts? And where are we at? Why did it suddenly start again?
There isn't. It's one of the puzzles. I mean, MH370
Hmm.
is a mystery full of mysteries.
Hmm.
One of them right now is, why did Ocean Infinity decide to spend more millions of dollars to search out the increasingly tenuous probability area of where this plane could have gone, according to the Inmarsat data? And they, who knows? I mean, it might be a tax write-off. It might be just that they have some assets that were sitting idle, so they decided to deploy them. It's free attention. I mean, there's any kind of number of explanations you could come up with, but I think there was the perception that, well, let me say this:
Hmm.
when they stopped searching the last time,
Yeah. 2018,
they
right?
said we will not take it up again unless we have new and compelling information.
Yeah.
So it sort of implies that they have new and compelling information. To be clear, they don't. There is
Maybe
no
just
there.
newer technology, or
Uh,
just
they
technology.
do have some new ships, but the new ships are not really optimized for this kind of search. And
Okay.
so the ship that they sent out actually was not very good at it and didn't cover that much ground. It searched out some areas that some people thought were of interest.
Mm.
They're basically just searching out where the conventional analysis says the plane might have gone. But all the easy answers have already been searched out. Like the idea of like maybe the pilot like took a suicide pill and let the plane fly straight until it ran out of gas and it crashed. We know that didn't happen because the plane would have been found already. So whatever happened to this plane is very, very strange. Now, we talked earlier about how people kind of emotionally like a kind of explanation. They like to have an explanation. They like to hold on to it.
Mm.
And yet in this case, we know that kind of simple, satisfying explanation is not right. Whatever happened to this plane, the case of people tend to think of MH370 as the plane that disappeared, as the Netflix documentary titled it.
Yeah.
The plane didn't just disappear. It didn't just vanish. Amelia Earhart vanished. She took off. She flew off into the night over the Pacific, and then she was never seen again. She just vanished. There have been multiple other cases of planes taking off, bye-bye, and then we never see you again.
Mm.
That's disappearing. What happened to MH370 is much more complicated and profoundly weird. And I think people really need to understand that. So if you're looking for a simple explanation, you're really starting off on the wrong foot.
So, what happens if Ocean Infinity fails again? Does that officially mark the end of the MH370 search era? Or does it reopen the possibility that we've been looking in the wrong place all along?
I mean, I've certainly been trying to bang the drum that we're looking in the wrong place ever since. I've been saying this since 2015. I think that the nature of a probability density is that it's strong and it's high in the middle, and then it gets weaker and weaker and weaker the further you go away. But it never really gets exactly to zero. There's no hard line where you can say, if I search this particular area, then some Australian officials had that miscomprehension initially, but no, it's just you can never say with 100% certainty that you failed. You might say with 99.9% certainty that you failed, at least according to our initial calculations. But there's always that grain of doubt. And so there's always going to be people who say, they're like, well, it must be in the southern Indian Ocean. Even if we've searched and searched and searched and it's not there, we should never doubt that. We should never doubt the certainty of our convictions, which I think is a mistake. Yeah. Unfortunately, the reality is that the area that they're searching is so tenuous. The probability area that they're searching right now is so low that failing is really not surprising and not really that indicative of where the plane is or isn't. If you are unwilling to accept any other possibility, you're kind of stuck and you will fail.
Right. So you've long argued that MH370 may not have gone south at all, right? That someone may manipulated the Inmarsat satellite data and spoofed the handshake signals and flew the plane towards Kazakhstan, right?
Exactly. No, you're spot on.
Yes. So, and at the heart of this hypothesis of yours is that the plane had some cybersecurity vulnerability.
Two in particular.
Can you lay out step by step the logic behind your theory and what led you there?
Sure. Well, it's a complicated case. I don't know if I can fully do it justice. I mean, I have this two-part podcast where I've been kind of laying out the things which people should definitely check out if they want to. But the short answer is that I said that this plane didn't just disappear. And what I mean by that is that step by step, a whole bunch of confusing and strange things happened. I sometimes call it the plane that disappeared 3 times. Sometimes I call it the plane that disappeared 4 times. Whoever was on board this, let's just sort of start by stipulating that this plane was taken by somebody on board the plane. It wasn't remotely hijacked, and it wasn't an accident, and all the other possibilities that people have floated. We know that those didn't happen for various reasons. So somebody on board this plane, 40 minutes into the flight, turned off all of the electronics so that it was invisible to air traffic control, and then did a 180, came back the way they'd flown originally, back over the Malayan Peninsula, up the Straits of Malacca, through primary radar coverage, And then once they left primary radar coverage, they were essentially invisible. They could have gone anywhere they wanted to. Nobody would have been the wiser. And then this very, very strange thing. I mean, everything that happened before this is pretty strange, but then something really strange happened, which is this box got turned on. Somebody turned on a piece of equipment on board the plane that created these signals.
Remote, is that what you've called, right? Is it
This
the
is
radio?
this is the satellite data unit. This is what connected to the Inmarsat satellite. And so
Okay.
as the plane's flying for 6 more hours, it's sending these signals automatically that don't contain any data. They're just basically the system saying to the satellite, hey, we're here. We're still flying in your coverage area. Stand
Yeah.
by. And so now this plane is in an electrical configuration that pretty much no plane has ever been in before, that no pilot I've ever talked to knows how to get it into that configuration or would want to get it into that configuration. And so we're in a very, very strange case. And as this is traveling now, as it's flying, it's sending these signals that later Inmarsat scientists would realize that, contrary to their expectations, actually contains some data that has a clue as to where the plane is going. And then this leads them, if once you do the analysis, it involves some fancy math, but once you do that math, it tells you that the plane went into this remote part of the southern Indian Ocean. And at that point, they feel relief, jubilation, excitement. They were like, we've solved this case using math. We know where this plane went. And this is why they said to the family members 2 weeks after the plane disappeared, they said, we're sorry, your relatives and friends are dead.
Yeah.
Because we have these signals that it says the plane went to the southern Indian Ocean. There's no islands there. There's no way they could survive.
Yeah.
So we know that your relatives are dead in the southern Indian Ocean. And since that day, the conventional wisdom has been that this is what happened, that somebody took the plane. Now, there's a kind of addendum to this, which is that, okay, who could have done this? Well, somebody took this plane deliberately. They flew it. How do you fly a plane? You fly it from the cockpit. And so whoever took this plane was in the cockpit. Now, 1 minute before all this stuff was turned off, the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, was on the radio with air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur and
Yeah.
said, good night, Malaysia 370. And so we have a guy we know is in the cockpit. A minute later, the plane disappears. This must be the culprit. So the conventional wisdom is that Zahari took the plane, obviously knew that he was going to die, obviously knew that he was going to kill everyone on board. So the dominant understanding of this case is that Zahari Ahmad Shah took the plane on a mass murder-suicide mission. But there's some big problems with this theory. Yeah. One of them is that the plane doesn't turn out to be in that area of the southern Indian Ocean where this theory would require that it wind up. Yeah. Another is that Zahari had no red flags. He didn't exhibit any. There have been cases of people destroying their planes in this way, a handful of cases. On all of them, the person is deeply disturbed. There's historical records of him having psychiatric issues, of having debt, having marital issues, being deeply distressed, being really at a crisis point. Zahari had no evidence of any of that. And then you have the fact that this box was turned on in a way that's very difficult to explain. Why doesn't make any sense in the context of someone trying to commit mass murder suicide. There have been people who've kind of theorized, well, maybe he wanted to pull off the perfect crime, but it wasn't a perfect crime because he was flying over like a Malaysian Air Force base with radar, and like they clearly saw him do it, and he's the obvious culprit. So it's not clear exactly what he's achieving by doing all of this. So very early on, I saw that there was a major problem with the Zahari theory. And I think what I started to ask myself was, is there another story that we can tell to make sense of this evidence? Is there any other explanation that we could arrive at, even contemplate? And it turns out that MH370 had a whole string of unusual characteristics that together created two potential cybersecurity vulnerabilities that would allow the plane to be taken and to make it seem like it went into the southern Indian Ocean when it went somewhere else. Now, this is controversial. I'm still working on it. But it seems to me that these, as far as I know, I don't see any reason why these things don't exist. And I think the fact that very, very few planes, maybe no other plane in the world except for MH370, had these vulnerabilities is deeply suspicious.
Hmm. So you think somebody got hold of the electronics bay or just got access to the electronics bay and
Right. So one of the unusual things about the 777 is that it has an electronics bay where all of the computers that control the plane reside, and which is unlocked and which is accessible to the passengers. It's at the front of the first class compartment. So if you have, and there are no, because of the era in which the 777 was designed and built, there are essentially no protections. There's no security layer. A lot of aviation security is sort of premised on the fact that you have to have access to a system in order to attack it. And the 777 is the only commercial airliner where you can access the brains of the plane through an unlocked hatch from the passenger compartment. So that's one thing that's unique about the 777 that makes it vulnerable. And to answer your question, yeah, so the idea is that if someone went down in there
Hmm.
and they changed they could have access to the system that the Inmarsat scientists later deciphered. And so if they were smarter than Inmarsat, they could fool Inmarsat. Now
So,
Inmarsat
yeah.
is completely unable to comprehend that concept. Like the idea that anyone is smarter
Hmm.
than Inmarsat is really hard for them to understand.
So, but has there been anyone in the flight's manifest that could be held suspicious or has that kind of a background? I'm sure there must have been deep research on who was traveling on that plane, right? And if somebody could be
I have
pinpointed.
spent a lot of time looking at three passengers in particular, because some of this data can be easily spoofed and changed. Some of it can't be easily spoofed and changed, and this part that can't be easily spoofed and changed itself is enough to suggest where this plane went. In fact, a fairly narrow path that goes over India, actually, over the Himalayas and into, as you mentioned, Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And there are several Russian bases in Kazakhstan that are essentially Russian territory with big,
Mhm.
long runways where you could land a plane. And so Russia has always been kind of top of my list of suspects. There were two ethnic Russians of Ukrainian nationality on the plane and a Russian
Mhm.
passport holder. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at them, and I don't really know. I don't have any kind of smoking gun. I spent a lot of time trying to find a smoking gun. I don't. The two Ukrainians are of particular interest to me. They were apparently somehow involved in the furniture business. They had a factory and some kind of retail establishment in Odessa. I actually went to Odessa to try to track this down. Nobody's really been able to tell me where this factory was or who
Okay.
their customers were. No, but I've talked to people in the Ukrainian furniture industry. Like nobody's heard of them. These guys apparently traveled frequently to Malaysia and China. It is, in fact, true that there was a furniture trade show taking place in Kuala Lumpur at that time.
Mhm.
But a lot of the story just doesn't really add up, and I don't really know. It's curious, but and somebody could have been on the plane that did this that wasn't these guys. That was somebody else. In spycraft, there's this idea of like assets that are like deeply hidden and can operate for years
Yeah.
under an assumed identity or something. So it's hard to either prove or disprove that there was like an agent on board this plane. But my point is basically, as so long as there is a possible alternative to the southern scenario, you really need to take it seriously because, as I say, the fundamental reality of this case is that it's really, really weird. And so we have to be in a mind space where we're open to really, really weird possibilities, as long as they're physically possible. Now, I
So,
should add that there's another cyber vulnerability that's necessary for all of this to make any sense. You have to also be able to take control of the plane from the electronics bay. And that's something I've been working on lately, where I've been kind of delving into the control architecture of the 777 flight system. And I think there is a way that this can be done. There are people who've said, Jeff, it's impossible. But nobody's explained to me why it's impossible. And I think if I'm hoping that if I can lay out a very simple route by which you could take control of the flight surfaces,
Hmm.
hopefully that will open people's minds a little bit.
And what do you think was happening at that point in time with the passengers and the crew on the plane and the pilots? Were they unconscious? What's the theory for that?
People ask that question a lot,
Yeah.
and I mean, the really best answer is that we just don't know. We don't have any evidence. We can speculate. Certainly, there has been speculation that it would be difficult for a handful of hijackers to control an entire, more than 200 passengers and crew. So maybe if you depressurize the plane, this would like knock them unconscious and ultimately kill them. It's possible. We really just don't know. At this point, I think what the conversation needs to be is what is the entire universe of possibilities of what happened to this plane? What are the things that we can seriously, and how can we be sure that we're looking at all of the possibilities and without being distracted by the infinite tidal wave of nonsensical ideas that have been floated and are really just a distraction and a sort of smokescreen?
What about the few pieces of physical evidence we do have? The Flaperon, for example, that washed up on Reunion Island.
Yeah, to
Um,
me, this is extremely interesting and an extremely potentially productive avenue of inquiry because these are the pieces that really are as you point out, the only physical evidence that we have in this case. And so now when they first started to wash ashore, the authorities got very excited because this at last there's a couple of things that we can do that hopefully this can help us tell us where to look.
hmm,
One of them is called reverse drift modeling. If you have a model of how the currents swish and swirl around the Indian Ocean, and you can kind of
mhm,
work backwards in time, and like where did this drift from? Most likely, um, they really struggled to make sense of that. There were pieces that were washing ashore in places that didn't really make any sense.
hmm,
Another avenue that presented itself was these pieces had creatures growing on them. They're
hmm,
called goose barnacles, or Lepus antitifera is the Latin name. And these are things that will, if you throw anything in the ocean, there's these little larvae that swim around all over the ocean. And as long as they find something that's floating, they'll latch onto it. They actually
hmm,
glue their heads onto
hmm,
onto the substrate, and they'll start to filter stuff out of the water, and they grow pretty quickly.
hmm,
And so if you can see how big these things are, that will tell you how long it's been floating. In the minerals of the shell will give you a clue as to the temperature of the water that it was floating at the time. If you cross correlate what the water temperature is at the different latitudes that the plane might have crashed at, that could tell you kind of exactly where you need to look. That
hmm,
was the hope. It didn't pan out. What happened was when they looked at these creatures, it turned out that they were only a couple of months old.
hmm,
And so, as far as we know, part of the problem is that we don't really know that much about Lepus antitifera barnacles. These are things that grow out in the middle of the open ocean on things that are floating around. How do you study something that's in the middle of the ocean floating around? It's very challenging. And the literature was very sparse. And so they sort of assumed, well, barnacles this big probably have been growing for 15 months because that's how long it had been since the plane crashed. So what I'm working on right now is I've actually spent the last about a year trying to collect data myself to try to better understand how these things grow. I came
hmm,
up with this idea in talking with some marine biologists that there are these things called drifter buoys that the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, puts in the ocean or helps people put in the ocean, and then uses satellite tracking to watch them move around, collects data about temperature, pressure,
hmm,
etc. And you can watch them go. And so actually all of them pretty much as they're drifting around, they're getting lepus growing on them. And
hmm,
when they go ashore, if you can get a helpful volunteer ashore to
hmm,
get it for you and send you specimens, you can you can correlate the specimens with the data from the satellite. And
hmm,
actually, I just got in the past week, I managed for the first time in about 6 months of trying to get some helpful people on Zanzibar to pick
hmm,
up a drifter buoy that had been floating for 10 months and has a nice healthy population of Lepus antitifera barnacles that we'll be able to analyze them chemically. We'll be able to match their size with how long it's been in the water. and we're going to finally be able to calibrate the Lepus antitifera that were found on the Flaperon in Reunion Island and really understand, really kind of narrow down on how long this thing was probably floating in the water. And that's extremely exciting. And so I'm a journalist, but really I've kind of found myself in the position of being a researcher as well to try, because there are gaps in our understanding. And I just wasn't really, because nobody else would seem interested in collecting this data. So I'm like, I'm going to go collect it myself. I have no budget. I have no money. And so I was able to do this essentially just with tools that are available freely on the internet, and like calling people up on WhatsApp and saying, hi, you don't know me, I'm calling from New York. And I have to explain the whole project. And I'll tell you, it's amazing how willing people have been to help. People get really pretty excited about the idea that, hey, I can be a key player in the solving of this mystery that's gripped the world's imagination.
But I think there was a recent report by the Al Qatan report, or which kind of suggested that the barnacle colonization began only after the Flaperon entered tropical waters, and which would actually be consistent with the southern trajectory carried by, it would have been carried by the ocean currents towards the African coast. And it was just, I mean, while it was in the cold waters, there was no colonization, and which kind of corroborates with the age of the barnacles being 5 months, etc. So, how do you square that new analysis with your northern landing theory? Or
I think that I don't know. I know the paper that you're referring to. I don't
yeah.
know if I would agree with that summary of the analysis. I think that there has been a puzzle
Mm,
um, about why these barnacles are the size that they are, and how big should they be. Now you mentioned, so these Lepus barnacles, um, they don't really grow under 18 degrees Celsius.
mm,
And so March of 2014, when the plane disappeared, this is the southern spring.
yeah.
Sorry, southern fall. It's the autumn. Things are
Mm,
starting to get cooler. However, the prevailing currents in that area are going to take it north into warmer water, and then it's
mm,
going to basically move it westward at the lower latitudes. And so, in order to get to Reunion, you need to have spent almost all of that time in water above 18 degrees Celsius. And so it's really hard to explain how you could have a barnacle that's maybe 3 months old after 15 months in the water, unless there are some possible explanations, like maybe it got predated, maybe some creatures like ate the whole population and then a new population had to grow. That's something that I'm going to be working on. I've reached out to several marine biologists
mm.
um, who study this question, and we'll be able to really delve into it and directly address the issue that you're raising. Like, is this something we can explain just by a
Yeah.
presumed drift pattern?
I guess I'll be following your podcast to get updates on your research on the barnacles. But let's take it to a bit more the geopolitical aspect of Russia being involved, right? Uh, what would you think was the strategic motive of Russia? I mean, what would Russia gain from diverting or disappearing a civilian airliner?
So the context of MH370 disappearing is that at this time, Russia is just in the process of kind of shifting its footing onto a kind of new Cold War. It's
Mm,
entering a gray zone, what we call hybrid warfare. It's also engaging what's called kinetic warfare against Ukraine. It's annexing part of the Donbass. It's annexing Crimea. It's using
mhm,
little green men.
mm,
The sort of the geopolitical position of Russia is that it feels threatened. It feels that NATO has encroached on its traditional hinterlands, and it is trying to go from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. And so you're
mm,
seeing Russian military intelligence getting involved in tampering in other countries' elections, including my own. It's assassinating rivals. It's feeding misinformation. It's doing hacking attacks. These are all ways to kind of push your enemy onto the back foot
mhm,
without risking an all-out war. Now, by the time 2022 rolls around, and Russia is like, screw it, we're just going to go all in. We're going to massively invade Ukraine. Things kind of take on a more hot aspect,
yeah.
but you see a massive coordinated campaign of sort of sowing chaos and sowing confusion and distraction. So when MH370 disappeared, Russia had just annexed Ukraine. It was being condemned. There were sanctions being put against it. And so when MH370 happened, it pulled world attention away from the atrocities in Crimea and focused it on something else. So that would be a potential motive. But when I pointed out that there was a possibility that Russia could be involved in
Mm-hmm.
this, there were two important predictions that this
Mm.
idea made. One prediction was that the plane would not be found on the southern seabed. Now, if you recall, in 2015, you go back and look at the media coverage, every serious person said that this is the answer. We know what happened to the plane. It has to be in the southern seabed. And to this day, many, many people, including Ocean Infinity, the Australian officials and everything, they say it has to be in the southern seabed. I've said, you won't find it. That's my prediction. You won't find it. The other
Mm.
prediction is that if I'm right, and this is what's happening, we should be really worried because we have a very resourceful and very ruthless adversary that is acting as though they are in a war with us,
Mm.
and we don't know it. We're being attacked, and we are not even in any kind of defensive posture at all. And so what you would expect to see is more attacks, more kinds of ways of subverting the West. And you might especially expect to see cyber attacks against airplanes in flight. And this was a really shocking idea. It seemed kind of impossible and outlandish, but this is exactly what we have seen. We've seen the Russians and the allies, the Belarusians, hijack a plane with a dissident on board. The Russians blew up a plane with a dissident on board. They have used GPS spoofing and jamming to perplex and confuse tens of thousands of flights in the Baltic area. And they just recently, within the last year, have been involved in planting incendiary devices in air cargo shipments, which is incredibly dangerous. And so exactly as I think my theory predicted, you have seen this kind of reckless and widespread Russian sabotage against the West.
But could there have been other states or interests with the motive? I mean, I could say maybe the US, China, North Korea. They're all geopolitical players who have all had a patchy history. For example, the Diego Garcia Air Base, right? It has too much coverage over that area. Why? And okay, and if your theory stands, why hasn't there been um, a retaliation from the U.S. in the sense, even a narrative retaliation? They don't seem to be kind of talking too much about this. Doesn't that feel a bit suspicious?
That would tend to undermine my theory that the United States hasn't realized it. I mean, I think the story that I'm telling is that sort of the struggle that I've been undertaking the last 11 years is trying to get people to take seriously a story that they do not want to take seriously. There's
Mm.
been very little desire to take this idea seriously, and to my dismay,
Mm.
because so this happened in 2014.
Yeah.
In 2015, you see the presidential race getting started. You see
Mm.
the GRU, and another contextual thing, the Russians so there was like 16 of these Malaysian Airlines 777s in the world in 2014. One
Mm.
disappears. 4.5 months later, another one gets shot down by the Russians, specifically in an operation managed by the Russian military intelligence, the GRU. And so to the conventional mind, it's merely a coincidence. Whereas to my mind, it's like it's almost like it's like a claiming of the event. And so we do have the GRU. Now, the same agency is also hacking into Democratic National Committee servers in the run up to the 2016 election, stealing all of these internal documents, and then the allies, the conservative movement in the United States, Fox News and these people are kind of making a meal out of it and making it seem like Hillary Clinton has all these secrets and all these like nefarious things she's doing, and basically helping to win the election for Donald Trump, who at the same time is breaking federal law in order to try to give himself an advantage. And so you have and to this day, really, it's been incredibly frustrating for me because you have this clear connection between Donald Trump and the Russians, and there is very little appetite for any of this. So really part of the struggle, and I do see MH370 as being linked to the descent into authoritarianism of the United States. We are living in a time where the ability of society to deal with reality has really been crippled in ways that we don't fully understand. Frankly, I don't really understand why we, like, for instance, Donald Trump is a convicted felon. He was convicted of these crimes that he committed in 2016,
Mm.
and it never gets mentioned. Like, it's just the New York Times and and CBS News, all of the major news outlets never talk about the fact that he's convicted, his like numerous connections to Vladimir Putin. So we live in it. You mentioned, like, why doesn't, if my theory has any credibility, why isn't it being taken seriously? I think that this is a major problem, that our imagination, our collective imagination, is unable to deal with the strange reality that we live in right now. People can't believe that basically American democracy was ended after 248 years, by a much weaker, smaller, less technologically advanced country,
Mm.
and in cahoots with conservatives and wealthy people, essentially. So we live in a very confusing and difficult time, and I'm hoping that we can somehow, by having these conversations, by understanding the nature of what's going on geopolitically and technologically, we can try to understand how we got to this absolutely insane state that we're in.
Right. Well, none of these are proven. And of course, the absence of confirmation opens the door not just to conspiracy, but to strategic opacity, which is how probably most governments operate when mistakes become unspeakable. But Ajay, what's striking is listening to your 10-year journey into MH370 is that even facts have started to feel unstable. The satellite data, the ocean drift models, the barnacle signs, the geopolitical readings. All of it generates possible truths, but no final narrative. And I wonder, when a story becomes this big, this prolonged, and this unresolved, does it stop being an investigation and start to become a myth? Do we reach a point where the pursuit of truth kind of collapses into the performance of truth seeking itself?
That's a very dark perspective. It's a good question, but I mean, I can't. I have to go on with my life. I have to get out of bed. I can't be that depressed. So I have to say no. I mean, listen, we collectively as a human race emerged from the darkness of hunter gatherer age, and we like learned to. We How did we achieve the society that we have today? How did we master the world as we have? Through science, through there are methodologies by which we can sort the true from the false. I don't think we can allow ourselves to get as depressed as as what you're portraying and say that, like, all truth is ultimately unknowable. I reject that hypothesis. I think truth is knowable, but I will
Yeah.
say it's very important. I think that what the idea that you're raising is very important and needs to be addressed.
Mm.
Because certainly, yes, if you look at the state of the discourse on the internet, it is
Yes.
just endless sniping. Nobody is getting anywhere. It
Yeah.
is like being in a medieval, religious civil war where, like, I believe this, I believe this, I'm just going to snipe at you. And like, there is no way forward. And so this is why I've been like collecting barnacles off of drifters. I need more evidence. But here's another thing. Science, how does science work? Science is like democracy in a way. And it's a collective effort that requires mutual trust among all the participants. And like democracy, it's pretty easy to poison.
Yeah.
If you can insinuate yourself into this community and snipe and like spread misinformation, and I'm seeing this actually in the world of MH370, there are some major players who are making stuff up and spreading it and having a great deal of effect. Now, how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
That's a question I wake up every day. How do I deal with this? How can I, as a journalist, I have a certain amount of platforms. I write for like fairly influential publications. So I'm not voiceless, and I have a certain I have certain powers, right? As a journalist, I can reach out to any marine biologist in the world and say, listen, I really want to understand the reproductive cycle of the Lepus antitifera. And the 6 or 8 people in the world that can answer that question are usually pretty happy to help me out. And so I've really gotten a lot of good response there. How do we change the narrative? How do we shift not just what's talked about, but how do we talk about it? How do we grapple with reality? How do we go from this kind of medieval, conflict of unexamined beliefs to a rigorous scientific inquiry into how do we weigh the facts? How do we know what a fact is? There is a methodology by which human beings can arrive at an understanding of the truth that then empowers them to take effective action. And so this is my lonely struggle. It's lonely at the moment, but I think people will get it if they listen to it for a little bit. There is a productive way to move forward.
Yeah,
And
hmm.
and so basically what I'm trying to say is like don't get too caught up on like maybe you don't think the Russians took this plane. That's fine. But do listen to me when it comes to talking about how do we adopt a productive methodology to talk about this and to talk about everything. Because we really, as a society, we are so confused that basically we allow democracy to die. And that's not good. So democracy is essential. Science is essential. An atmosphere of mutual societal trust is essential to living a life which is productive, happy, it allows everyone to live their best life, and we can avoid the horrors of war, which I feel is the inevitable path that we're heading down. So how can we do better? That's what I really want to talk about.
Well, you do speak from a very idealistic lens, but if I were to slightly look at it from perhaps a more socio-economic perspective or a critical lens, don't you think that there is a strange economy here? The less we know, the longer the story lasts. And do you think the uncertainty has become its own kind of commodity?
That's really interesting. I mean, you're sort of saying like there maybe some actors within this world are motivated for it not to be solved because an unsolved mystery
This
is sort
whole
of
industry, which is, I'm not saying you're part of this, but all I'm trying to say is that there are too many charlatans, there are too many, just theory givers and social
yeah.
media. It's still, I mean, the story is still alive, and it still has a market. People are still trying to look for answers, and it kind of does benefit a lot of people if the story keeps alive. And if
Yeah.
it's somehow, if we find MH370 and the story is resolved, that industry kind of just shuts down.
I mean, I think everything you're saying is true. I would counter that that's true of almost everything. That every single topic under discussion, whether it's abortion or in my country, everything that just people like to talk about, it's just like a mishmash of like people have opinions. I'm just going to have my opinion, and like someone who likened it to sports radio, where a team plays another team. People listen. I like this team. Oh, I think that they should have a better offensive strategy. I think they should have a better defensive strategy. And everyone's entitled to their opinion. Nobody really knows anything. It's
Mm-hmm.
just everyone throwing in their uninformed 2 cents, and it just goes around and around and around. And so that's everything. And yes, it's true of MH370, but I mean, and some people enjoy it. I personally don't. I like a sense of forward motion. I do think that we can't really control our lives unless we understand our circumstances. So I really like trying to like understand what the heck's going on. We talked about Air India, the crash. I said like the public tends to focus on the tragedy, the human loss, but for air crash investigators, it's an opportunity to understand how to prevent these things in the future. So for me, MH370 is not just, I don't want clicks. I mean, I ultimately need to get clicks if I'm going to like try to make this case to the public. But what I really want is to
Mm-hmm.
people to adopt a useful framework, a useful methodology. I want to understand it because I want to prevent it from happening again. And this is, I think, a really important distinction to make between what I think are the two theories, the pilot suicide and the third
Mm-hmm.
party hijacking. If it's a pilot suicide, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
You are excused from trying to make any effort to make the things different. You're just going to have to accept that there's a 1 in a trillion chance that the plane you're about to get on is going to get flown into the ocean by a deranged pilot. Okay, so that's a justification for passivity. If it's a third-party hijacker, then you need to think about cybersecurity as an entire field that needs to be developed and nurtured as much as safety has been in the past. And so you've got a big job ahead of you. Now, there is, I should point out, I think a lot of people don't really realize this. There's an entire industry of aviation cybersecurity. There's people that wake up every single day, put on their pants, and go to work thinking about how to protect the information systems that operate aircraft and the aviation industry writ large. How do we prevent getting hacked? Yeah. It's a major thing. It's a real thing. It's not that it's being ignored totally, but I think people don't really realize how important it is. Now, recently, there was a month after that crash we discussed in Washington, D.C., planes started to get phantom reports on their TCAS systems in the D.C. area, that same airport, really, really near where that crash occurred. And it turned out that our own government was hacking those systems, was sending falsified spoof signals into these planes' collision avoidance systems. And 3 of them actually aborted their landings because they were getting these falsified signals. So our own government was hacking these flights. We have no idea why. I mean, we can make guesses, but we have no evidence as to why they would do this. Right. But people need to understand that if the second theory is true, or even if it might be true, or even if it's not true, frankly, the implication of it is that we need to really start taking it seriously. Because there are ways that, and I talk about this in the podcast, there's ways that you can spoof an unsecured system on an airplane and make it crash.
Right. So interesting that you say that. Yesterday, I was interviewing a top cybersecurity expert, and I asked her this question that the World Economic Forum has predicted that the next pandemic is going to be a cyber pandemic, and and she completely dismissed that. And I said, look, if it's coming from World Economic Forum, all of us got into a panic. We thought that probably aircrafts would be falling out of the sky. And she's like, it's a bunch of buzzwords and nonsense. It's never going to happen. Anyways, I had left it to that because there was a shortage of time. But yeah, but what you're saying is somewhere, I think, I pretty much lean on, what you're saying, that it's quite possible. Given
I don't know why you would say that it's impossible that things are going to get hacked. Everything can get hacked. Cars can get hacked. Your phone can get hacked. Your light bulb can get hacked. The Internet of Things is everywhere. The vulnerabilities of Internet. As I said, there is an entire industry devoted to studying this in order to prevent this from happening. There's another industry that we don't see because it's secret of countries, security apparatus, studying how to hack into each other's computer systems. Every country is hacking into every other country. And so I don't know exactly what she meant when she said that that's never going to happen, because it's already happening. It's happening with the GPS spoofing. It's happening with the TCAS jamming and spoofing. No, it's real. And but it's part of the struggle to make people think that it's urgent, because it's all a little bit abstract.
Right.
All right. Until people start to die. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, open up your mind to the possibility that the 239 people on board MH370 are no longer with us, not for the reason that you think, but maybe, just maybe, at least consider it, that the cyber hacking that we've seen proliferate around the world in the last 11 years, this might have been that sort of Pearl Harbor, like the attack that begins an entire broad war.
And even the Air India crash, I think when it crashed, there was this floating theory that its software might have been hacked as well. I mean, I don't think it has gained much momentum as such, but it is a possibility, right?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what theories gain momentum or don't. What will happen was that the facts will come out, and hopefully will gain clarity. Now, there's always that sort of skipped heartbeat of, like, what if we don't? What if, like, all the answers come out and we don't understand? I mean, there was this horrible crash in South Korea, the Jeju crash.
Yeah.
And again, it's like, where's the data? Like, what happened? Unfortunately, in that case, because of another sort of string of unfortunate coincidences, we don't have the black box data because of this particular model of plane, and it didn't have the backup emergency electrical system, whatever. The black box stopped recording. So we're missing a lot of the data that would be really useful. But hopefully they'll be able to overcome that, because we really, really want to understand, why did that crash happen? And until we understand it, I mean, you really can't rule out. You're going to have to really dive deep. If you want to rule out a cyber attack, you have to really explain why there's no system that could cause this behavior. But it requires effort, and I think you do have to really, in the absence of a convincing explanation, you're really going to have to start to roll up your sleeves and look at all the possibilities.
In a scenario that, what if the investigators do find out that it was a software hack, just hypothetically speaking, would it, I mean, be given the implications of what it might imply, the magnanimity of it would be, I don't know, it would probably put people into panic. And do you think that kind of information would ever be made public, or it would just somewhere be, it would never be made public, and we would never know if the truth that comes out is going to be too uncomfortable to be shared with the world?
I mean, I guess all you can really do is speculate. I mean, I think it would seem to, look, we know that human beings have caused aviation tragedies before. Like, look at Lockerbie, or I mean, MH17. People have caused the destruction of hundreds of civilians and an airplane. Whether that could be done through cyber means as opposed to a bomb or a missile. Well, listen, you could easily paint a picture where something like that happens. I wouldn't want to get ahead of ourselves and like, because then it does start to feel like conspiracy. We don't know. Powerful forces are preventing us from knowing. Look, ultimately, if the public applies enough pressure, and there's enough outrage and enough editorials and people with signs are saying, like, you have to tell us what happened to this plane. We depend on aviation. We can't just not know when we get on a plane. I refuse to accept that. You have to open up to us. But my fear, to pull back the lens once more and say, if we're living in a world where we allow corrupt criminals to run our society, to corrupt our society, to undermine our trust in institutions like our aviation regulators, like our airplane manufacturers, like our air crash investigators, we don't trust anybody anymore.
Yeah.
We don't have confidence in what's happening. And then we get into a state where it's like Russia. Every country is like Putin's Russia, where the Russian-British journalist Peter Pomerantsev wrote a book called "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And that phrase, I think, really kind of encapsulates the sort of cynical mindset that can pervade an authoritarian society, where everyone just trusts everyone. And it's very hard to get from that state of pervasive mistrust and doubt to a democracy, which requires trust. So trust is such a valuable commodity that we really need to cherish it and nurture it. And unfortunately, my country is slipping quickly into a very dark state. I hope we can somehow pull out of it. Hope is not a very useful instrument for affecting action, but I mean, God help us is all I can say.
Well, let me just pivot to um, slightly more concrete category here. And for all the complexity that we've discussed, narrative, institutions, geopolitics, the machine itself hasn't changed much. Commercial flight today is more or less the same as it was perhaps in the 1990s. The Concorde was faster than anything that we have now, and that disappeared. There's been no paradigm shift in safety, really. I mean, as far as I can understand it, no radical redesign. So, why do you think that has been the case?
That's a really, really interesting question. I think you're raising a really good point. In some ways, it seems like aviation has moved backwards. As
Yeah.
you're saying, like, we fly slower than we did in the 70s.
Yeah.
So have we really just stagnated? I think if I could play devil's advocate, I would say that what has happened is that there have been important changes, but they're kind of invisible. And
Okay.
what we've seen is a really dramatic increase in safety
Mm-hmm.
and efficiency. And so in the sort of Buck Rogers, 20th century, where everyone wanted to go to the farthest planets and really quickly, and we've moved away from speed to efficiency. So airline tickets are much cheaper than they were in the 70s, especially here in the United States, and that's partly economic. But it's partly technological because we had the 737 MAX crash. That was caused because they had these new efficient engines, which are really big. It turns out that to make an efficient engine, it needs to be big. And that gets down to physics. But and then they had to like change the center of gravity, and that led to some other problems. But so we haven't really stagnated. It feels like we've stagnated, but everything's much safer now and everything's much more efficient now. And I think in a way, if you look at the biological record, evolutionary record, you see
Mm-hmm.
organisms that kind of like change quickly over time, and they arrive at a kind of form that then becomes very stable. And then you have that same kind of form for tens of
Mm.
millions of years. And I think in a way, I see that aircraft are kind of converging on an optimal solution for the current circumstances. Now, I actually did an article for Popular Mechanics quite a while ago, but I was saying, like, why do all planes look alike? Back in the 70s, we had the Concorde, we had the 747 with its double deck and 4 engines.
Yeah.
We had the L-1011 with 3 engines in the tail, and or 2 engines on the wing and then 1 engine in the tail. Excuse me. But that's all gone away. Everything is single level, and it has 2 engines. Everything. And why is that? And the answer has to do, I think, with this idea of convergence. Like, that's the optimal way to make an airplane. And everything else that doesn't look like that is less efficient, and so it just doesn't exist anymore. It's really like a kind of a parallel to evolution.
What about the
So,
A380? That has two levels, right? Or
which one?
the A380?
Don't make it anymore.
Okay.
I mean, it still operates,
Still
yes, but it's
operating, but
like a
they're not making any.
historical relic. It's a historical relic at this point.
Okay.
You raise a good point, though. That is true.
Mm. Um, and what about over reliance on software layers? We've the 737 Max crashes. They happen because of that MCAS software, and I think the pilots were not trained enough. And and systems today kind of depend on cascading software interactions. Where is that
Yeah,
take?
I mean, I think you're raising a really important point, which is that as we rely increasingly on automated systems and the
Yeah.
software that run them
Mm.
to carry out the efficiency and the safety that we require,
Mm-hmm.
does that pose a problem? Does that pose potential dangers and threats? And I think that yes, it is something that we really have to bear in mind. There's particularly, I've been sort of banging this drum for a long time, is that as plane crashes become more and more rare in absolute terms, we're seeing an increase in the proportion of those accidents that somehow involve the interaction between humans and automated systems, where the humans might not understand what the automated system is trying to do, and the automated system might not be able to handle, might not have been able to design this particular strange situation that it's got itself into. And I think that Max crashes are an example of that. So yes, complex systems can harbor these sort of hidden corners where scary things can happen. And for engineers to try to eliminate those corners it's a tough task. And then the other aspect is that security aspect. If you have a very complex system, that can result in what cybersecurity experts call an attack surface. The
Hmm.
different ways that
Yeah.
a malicious or malevolent actor can get into it and make it do things that the operator doesn't expect. And so that also is a major problem. And to complicate things for the aviation industry is that every plane that's flying today is a kind of Frankenstein creature of different systems that have been developed over the years, and all
Hmm.
of which have different levels of security sophistication. And a lot of these old legacy systems have no security layer whatsoever. And so I did a podcast episode about this. It's called the Instrument Landing System. It was developed like after World War II. It involves like it's not digital at all. It's like it's an analog system that involves the interaction of radio waves. And there was a crash in Vilnius within the last year where it looked a lot like a proposed hack that somebody had published, saying that you could actually tamper with the system pretty easily and make a plane descend below its glide slope. The jury is really out on that. I tend to doubt that it really was a hack, but you have to start thinking what system might have been involved in a crash like this, because even if it's not right, and again, this gets back to something you mentioned really, really early on, which is like, what is the theory? If you start promoting theories too early, it prevents you from looking at other theories. And many times, an aspect of crashes being really rare is that they're often very weird. Like you have to have a confluence of unusual events all occurring simultaneously for this 1 in a million event to take place. And so your assumptions about like, this is how planes usually go, this is how pilots usually react, those might be wrong, because you might be dealing with, maybe there's an unusual equipment failure combined with somebody having like a diabetic attack or something like that. You know what I'm saying? And so we really have to try to train ourselves. This is something that professional air crash investigators do as a matter of course, but it's not so easy for the general public. Keep an open mind. Please keep an open mind. Don't be credulous. This is the balancing act. This is why everything is so difficult. We have to, on the one hand, keep an open mind to real possibilities, even super unusual ones, but we have to shut our minds to just all of the like insane nonsense. So we have to filter.
I know, but after this conversation, given the amount of parameters you just mentioned, I just kind of feel that why do we still call aircraft travel safe? Because there are so many dynamic parameters, and why is it still safe? Or why is it safe?
It's safe and getting safer, broadly written. I mean, as I said, all of this sophistication is going to make it safer. And you look at the statistics, it's getting more and more rare. Now, because these don't happen every week, thank God, when they do happen, they do get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And we have come to expect better. And I think it's good that we expect better. But they do become more and more like the low-hanging fruit. Did the plane crash because the pilot was drunk? Maybe in the 50s, right? We've managed to get rid of that. We've gotten rid of a lot of the obvious, there were plane crashes because people didn't install a part properly. Well, okay, let's revamp our maintenance procedures. And so the low-hanging fruit, the obvious stuff is all taken away, thank God. Now we're left with the really difficult stuff that's hard to understand. We really have to rely on the expertise. And part of this problem, this gray war situation we're on right now, where there's a deliberate attempt to erode faith in expertise. This is part of the autocratic impulse. And so you see in the United States, our healthcare system, such as it is being run by a person who doesn't believe in germs. I mean, it's like we're back in the 16th century now. Yeah. Where these people just they just don't. The fact that someone is an expert makes them doubt them. And so we need to pull out of this whole mindset. We need to pull out of this sort of social political moment that we're in. But for the time being, we are the recipients of a century plus of really hard work, really a ton of dedicated people, knowledgeable people doing their damnedest every single day to go out there and make a system that works better. And what we've got it's amazing. I mean, it would be amazing just if you could buy a ticket on a plane to go from Delhi to New York. I mean, if you could go from Delhi to New York in less than 24 hours, think about that. That's amazing. The fact that it's also affordable to a middle-class person and is safe, I think that's more amazing than the moon landing in a way. And it just doesn't get attention because we're so used to it. And so you might think that air travel doesn't feel safe anymore, But it is insane how safe it is, and what an amazing human achievement. What a testament it is. It's so easy to get depressed about all the nonsense, all the lies, all the dishonesty and the corruption. Human beings are and have always been complex creatures with light and dark, and we see that. I mean, I think in aviation today, you see like it. We have to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, because it is amazing. My grandfather was born in 1899. They had horses and carriages and trains, and he died in a world that had Concords and moon landings. And well, they didn't have the internet yet, but imagine the change in the world that took place since he was born. And so I think it is an age of miracles. We have angels and demons. Unfortunately, we have to wrestle with and like history goes up and down. Who knows who knows if we're, Rome circa 450 AD or something. But listen, all we can do, what you're doing, what I'm doing, why we're having this conversation right now, is because we care. And we're interested and we're engaged and we want to understand better. And we're filled with fear and we're filled with hope. And we're trying to do something. We're trying to ask, what can we do as individuals? And ultimately, as individuals, we're just carried along in the river of circumstance, of history, right? But occasionally, like one little algae, one little plankton in that river is going to do something and change the flow of history. And together, collectively, the river decides where it wants to go. My metaphor is completely botched by now, but I think you get what I'm getting at.
No, I absolutely appreciate, and it reassures me what you just said. And I think it's a very good point where we could close the interview. And but yet, in the end, I just want to say that, when Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished, so did our faith in the systems that promised to find it. The satellites spun, the experts debated, but the oceans gave nothing back. Perhaps the real wreckage wasn't in the sea, it was in the silence, in the realization that we don't just lose planes, we lose the frameworks that tell us how to think about them. And then it happens again. Air India Flight AI171 falls out of the sky. A tragedy, but also a signal that the ground beneath our certainties is no longer solid. As we await the official report, another question hovers. When the answers come, will we believe them? This was Jeff Wise. This is Dark Matter, Bright Minds. Keep listening.